Before the dancing mailboxes, before the cha-cha slide, Philly streets overflowed when votes were cast. In fact, the street was where Philadelphians cast their vote for a long, long time. At least it was for those who could vote, because most weren't allowed to cast a ballot. Voting was rough. It was raucous. It required stamina. And some historians wonder if the relatively peaceful polls we've experienced in the 20th century were an anomaly rather than the norm. Maybe the more contentious voting of recent years is our American democracy returning to its explosive origins. It's the history of Election Day in the streets of Philadelphia. Are you ready? This is Found in Philadelphia, a podcast dedicated to telling the stories of Philadelphia's past so that we can better understand the present, because our history matters. I'm your host, Lori Ament. With each episode, I hope that you'll learn something new, see things a little differently, and be inspired to go discover some of this history for yourself, right here in the city of brotherly love. This episode is the first in a 4-part series about Election Day in the streets of Philadelphia. This mini-series is a bit different than the other episodes in this series about the history of Philly streets. This one looks at Election Day throughout Philly's history, rather than taking a deep dive into one era. In this episode, we'll discuss voting up to the American Revolution. And I want to dedicate this episode to all of the poll workers, the ballot counters, and the Get Out the Vote volunteers. You show up early and stay late. We couldn't celebrate this democracy without you. Election Day is a public ritual where voters claim their rights as full-fledged citizens to decide who will represent them in government. Now, Election Day is certainly not the only way we engage as citizens. We sit on juries, we sign contracts, we petition and protest. But many of us vote during the 13 hours that polls are open on Election Day. The day remains our most public and unifying civic ritual. And for much of Philly's history, a lot of the action on Election Day took place in the public space of the streets. The day was prime time for political theater. Human beings performed a political ceremony on Election Day in this shared public space. In the performance, it was clear that certain types of people had the right to vote and had that right protected. They were the main performers on Election Day. Voters could see each other and identify as a group, and equally important, they could be seen by others. Those relegated to the role of observer, those without political power. Our guide to the performance of Election Day in Philadelphia is Professor Mark Bruen, Associate Professor of Media Studies at the University of Tulsa. This episode is built around his 2008 book, Celebrating Democracy, The Mass-Mediated Ritual of Election Day. His book grew out of his PhD work at the University of Pennsylvania here in Philadelphia. I had so much fun speaking with Professor Bruen earlier this year, and I'm so pleased to introduce you to his work. Here's Professor Bruen.
My name is Mark Bruen. I'm an associate professor of media studies at the University of Tulsa in Tulsa, Oklahoma. My primary focus is on political communication, political media, and also the history of media technologies and media forms. One of the classes I teach at Tulsa is on public space in the city. So I'm actually just also interested in the use of streets as public spaces and political spaces.
I want to begin this discussion of Election Day with the Lenape. These were the Native Americans who lived in the Philadelphia region before Europeans arrived, and they continued to control this area until the late 17th century. The Lenape didn't have an election day. Lenape government was a decentralized organization of affiliated towns. Each town claimed control of an area of land where different family groups lived. Within this area, the town leader was chosen by a council of family elders, including both men and women. Leaders maintained their position by seeking consensus among the different members and then doing what the community expected them to do. In times of war, the leaders would also confer with neighboring leaders, but they remained free to make their own decisions for their community. Women were key decision makers. Lenape clans were based on the female line. You belong to your mother's clan. And while women were not selected as leaders, they were important members of the Council of Elders that chose the leader and made important decisions for the community. And before we leave the Lenape, it's important to note that the Lenape are not gone. They're still here. Today, the Lenape diaspora has 3 federally recognized tribal governments located in areas where they were forced to migrate in New York, Wisconsin, and Oklahoma. And while Delaware and New Jersey both recognize Lenape and Delaware tribes, the state of Pennsylvania does not. Though there is an effort by the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania to change that. So when European settlers moved into Lenape country in the 1600s, they brought very different ideas about government and society. The area that became Philadelphia first saw Dutch and then Swedish explorers who were looking to trade with the Lenape for furs that were in much demand for making felt for hats. By the time William Penn's followers arrived in the 1680s, they needed to negotiate with both Swedes and Native Americans to begin building on the land that would become the future city of Philadelphia. Unlike the Lenape, people in colonial Philadelphia lived in a society with a rigid, male-dominated hierarchy. Servants and enslaved people deferred to masters. Women and children deferred to the male head of the household. Working classes deferred to the upper classes. Less wealthy male property owners deferred to the economic elite. And at the top of the ladder, there was, of course, the king. This hierarchy determined who could rule and who could choose those rulers. Only a few wealthy white men with sufficient property, education, and leisure could hold office. Less powerful white men didn't hold office, but they were given the right to vote. They basically got to decide which members of the elite should hold political power. To be able to vote in colonial Philadelphia, you had to be 21, male, a natural-born or naturalized subject of the English king, and a resident of Pennsylvania for 2 years. In addition, you needed to own at least 50 pounds worth of property, or own 50 acres of land with 10 of those cleared for farming. These men were assumed to have the best interests of the community. The vast majority of residents in colonial Philadelphia could not vote. The law excluded most men who were working class or poor. It excluded all women, indentured servants, and enslaved Africans who lived here. However, social status among the upper class in the colonies was fuzzy. More workers could vote in Philadelphia than they could in England. The need for a white male to own 50 pounds worth of property was actually a fairly low bar. Many skilled workers who owned their own tools could become voters. This meant that the gap between the prosperous working class and the elite was not as great in the new city. Here's Professor Bruin.
Underlying all of this is probably an awareness not always fully articulated that, it's just harder to control the lower orders in North America than it is in England. One of the important things about voting in a place like Philadelphia is that the percentage of, working class men who could vote was just much higher. So there were just a lot more of the popular classes that were able to go to the polls. And so the ruling class's hold on power was always was just weaker.
And this weakness of the elites made Election Day rituals that much more important in colonial Philadelphia. It was critical to publicly showcase those who were in power, the social superiors, to make that distinction very clear. For that reason, Election Day became an important annual event that reestablished the power of the elite. It was a single day set aside for the very public performance of voting, and it sent a clear message that certain people had the right to rule and to vote, while the rest were to be ruled. because the idea of a single election day was a new one. In England, at this date, there was no single day for voting across the country. Voting in England took place whenever it was most convenient during an election season. Professor Bruin explains this break from English voting traditions.
So the idea of a specific day is not part of the tradition. What usually would happen in the past was there would be an election period, and different parts of a county might vote on different days. And even sometimes the polls might be open for, 2 or 3 days to allow everybody to get to them. So there's not really a single moment in time when people are voting. And that gets changed. It's not just Pennsylvania in this case. I think also parts of New England are also establishing a regular and often yearly election day. So that takes place every year, sort of on the same date. And that's pretty new.
In his earliest charter, William Penn established Election Day as October 1st across Pennsylvania. Voters from Philadelphia to Lancaster would all vote on the same day. Professor Bruin argues that a common election day created a sense of shared community among voters in the colony.
They're all going to the polls on the same date, doing the same thing. And they know that. They know that this is happening. Most of the people who are doing the same thing, they're not running into because they're in other parts of the colony, but they are sort of conducting their activity at the same time with the awareness that they're doing so. And I wanted to suggest that that's a way of sort of establishing a sense of common identity.
One way that voters shared the Election Day experience was by reading about it. In the weeks leading up to Election Day, residents could learn about the candidates from two main sources. The first source of information was the newspaper. But newspapers were heavily censored in the colonies, and they presented Election Day as the political elite wished to have the day portrayed. They wrote about Election Day as a day of good governance and selfless deeds, full of unity. But the second source of information presented a different story. Colonial Philadelphia streets were full of anonymously produced pamphlets and single-sheet broadsides. These were cheap to print and widely available. And when elections were contested, they read like highly partisan attack ads. Different interest groups viciously attacked each other's candidates and their morals. These cheap publications sent a very different message than unity. On Election Day itself, all of the activities took place at the city courthouse. This was a 2-story brick structure which stood in the middle of the street at 2nd and High Street, what we now call Market Street. The city courthouse had these elaborate double-entry stairs that ran up to the 2nd floor level and allowed a good view of the intersection. The market stalls stretched out to the west behind the courthouse, but the market was actually closed on Election Day to avoid crowding. Professor Bruin describes the election grounds on Election Day.
A lot of it sort of taking place around that courthouse area. And so people are probably milling about. They're talking to one another. They might be coming in and out of, like you say, coffee houses and pubs. This would be one of those moments of the year when, you know people are going to be down there. So you're going to go down there just to meet your neighbors and friends and so forth. Some of those people would be voters, but not everybody's going to be a voter. It's just a moment of community. So the voting booths in Colonial Philadelphia were on the 2nd floor of the building. So you had to go up the stairs to get to the booths, and then you went down the stairs on the other side. And so people are also doing that all day as well.
Election Day began with the sheriff ringing bells from the top of the stairs at the 2nd floor level of the city courthouse. From this height, the sheriff, an elected elite, occupied a platform that looked out on the people gathered at the intersection below him. The sheriff began by making some announcements. Then they would proceed to select the election inspectors, who would spend the day inside the courthouse collecting and later counting votes. Up until the 1740s, the election inspectors in Colonial Philadelphia were chosen in the traditional manner of voting by view. This was how elections had been done in England. To vote by view, voters would show up at a prominent public space and cast their vote by standing in either one side of the space or another. An official would view the size of the groups in each area and decide who won. A relic of this type of voting remains in some states that caucus in person to select party candidates during primaries. In Philadelphia, the election inspectors were chosen by voters standing to either the north or the south side of the intersection at 2nd and Market. Then they could be counted by the sheriff, who was standing at the top of the courthouse stairs. However, this open vote, taken at a crowded street intersection, could present challenges to the sheriff. Were all of these men able to vote? Were there any non-voters in this crowd? As Colonial Philadelphia grew and the streets became more and more densely populated, you can understand why this form of voting died out. Once the election inspectors were sorted out, then voting could begin. And voting in Philadelphia was a bit of an innovation in colonial days. Pennsylvania was one of the first in the colonies to use a secret ballot to vote. In Colonial Philadelphia, voters wrote out their own ballots at home and brought them to the courthouse on Election Day. The ballots were actually several pieces of paper, a different piece of paper for each office they were voting for, whether it be assembly representative, sheriff, coroner, commissioner, or town burgess. The voter wrote the name of the office on one side and the person they were voting for on the other side. Compare that to voting in a place like Virginia, where voters cast their votes out loud in front of a crowd, often with the candidates present. Everyone knew exactly who you voted for. But Philadelphia's secret ballot didn't mean that voters always voted their conscience. Professor Bruin explains.
Philadelphians are quite proud of the fact that their ballots are secret, and the fact that that means that people are not pressured to vote one way or another. But there are other ways to influence whose names get on those ballots. And so there's often backroom politicking. A slate gets decided, it gets publicized, and they understand who they're supposed to write in on their ballots. And it's rarely the case that the people who are elected change much year over year.
And the secret ballot changed the feel of the good old English Election Day tradition of, quote, treating.
There was this old tradition called treating, because it was often fairly obvious under an open voting system who's supporting you, right? The candidate would treat his voters to maybe a beer, but Philadelphians and Pennsylvanians are using ballots. So they're not open voting, right? And so the candidate maybe wants to get to the voter before he gets to the polls, just to sort of ingratiate himself. Treating in Philadelphia fairly quickly, it became difficult to distinguish between a treat and a bribe.
So, fortified with a drink, or maybe a bribe, each voter would have to deal with those double set of stairs leading up to the second floor of the courthouse in order to cast their ballots. This was the challenge. Voters had to walk up one side of the double stair. They had to make their way to an open window at the top of the stairs at the second floor level. Once there, they would reach through that open window and place their ballots in a ballot box manned by one of those recently selected election inspectors who stood inside the courthouse. Then the voter would walk across the platform, recently quitted by the sheriff, and then head down the steps to the street level on the opposite side. Officials were forbidden from opening the ballot boxes until counting began at the end of the day. The large double stair that rose to the second floor level of the courthouse created a very public stage for Election Day voting. Here, those who were able to vote were literally on display to the crowd of non-voters who observed from the street below. And these non-voters were an important part of the spectacle. The spectators were supposed to observe and know their place, to show their proper lower status in the hierarchy. They were not to drink and brawl and generally enjoy the holiday atmosphere, which many of them did. On this day, the street was very much used as theater, and those great double stairs at the courthouse provided the stage. Here's Professor Bruin to describe how Election Day was supposed to go.
What's supposed to happen? By supposed, I guess it would mean what sort of the ruling classes of Pennsylvania sort of want to see happen is that you have people calmly walking up the stairs, giving their ballots through the window. And the ballots are filled with a number of names, right, of their representatives. And often these slates have kind of been informally chosen by the ruling elite themselves. And so everybody sort of has been told in one way or another who they should be voting for. And so if it works fairly orderly, then it is theater, and the message is a very conservative one. It's a demonstration and it's a performance of power. We sort of publicly demonstrate our allegiance to our betters by reelecting them to the assembly year after year after year. It's just this regular reaffirmation of established power.
The only problem was that Colonial Philadelphia was a surprisingly diverse place. Men sometimes disagreed about which elite should be in power. And then, on Election Day, those double stairs to the courthouse displayed the elite's fractures. Here's Professor Bruin.
There is more dissension within Philadelphia and Pennsylvania than there are some of these other colonies. And sometimes that gets played out in a contested election. And then you get fights. And then you get that sort of demonstration of difference. And so then it becomes kind of a problem for the ruling class instead of that kind of affirmation that they're hoping to achieve.
During contested elections, there was a new element on the grounds during Election Day.
Occasionally, different groups might enlist their own private muscle to make sure that their voters are protected and nobody's harassing them, and on the lookout for people from maybe a competing group who might be trying to push people around. So there's that almost an element of small gangs on either side. Didn't always happen because the elections weren't always contested. But when they were, you might see some of that activity going on as well.
The problem was those double stairs at the courthouse. Those stairs provided the only access to the second floor windows where the ballot boxes were located. It didn't take long for the different factions to figure out that whoever controlled access to the stairs controlled the vote. Election Day in Philadelphia became known as the Trial of the Stairs. Professor Bruin gives us a taste of what it was like.
So the Trial of the Stairs was something that was a feature on and off of elections generally. And one of my favorite descriptions is this fairly well-to-do fellow who is writing to a friend about the effrontery of this basically working class, big burly guy who stops him at one point when he's walking up the stairs to give his vote, and he grabs his ballot from him, which sort of shows you the complicated message of the ballot itself, because it wasn't secret. It was supposed to be secret, but often wasn't secret. And the guy looks at the ballot and he goes, "Oh, that's no good," and he kind of throws it away. And he says, "Here, you'll want to use this one, right?" And he gives him a ballot with a bunch of different names on it. And the guy's name's Peters. Peters is, he's astounded, first of all, that somebody's, shoving a different ballot in his hand. And the fact that it's this sort of low-born sort of, mechanic makes it even worse. And that, in some sense, is the trial for the stairs, because these tough guys on either side are trying to control who goes up the stairs to get to the polling window.
Voter harassment became the norm during contested elections in Philadelphia. Men crowded on the block stairs, and it could take hours sometimes to make your way through. Different factions even blocked access to the stairs entirely, a practice known as holding the stairs. And both the Quaker elites and the more populist factions were guilty of doing it. This practice of holding the stairs led to Election Day violence, especially in 1742. For many years, the Quaker elites had been guilty of using physical muscle on Election Day to control the stair, picking and choosing who would climb the stairs to cast their ballots. The opposition, the Proprietary Party, was fed up with these tactics, so they recruited some muscle of their own treating working class men in low-class drinking establishments and entertaining them with bonfires. And on Election Day, October 1st, 1742, a group of sailors, egged on by the proprietary party, armed themselves with sticks and proceeded to the intersection in front of the courthouse. The sailors arrived during the selection of the inspectors, when men were lining up to indicate their choice. They swung their sticks into the crowd, knocking people to the ground and beating them up. Then the sailors returned later when voting started. This time they threw stones and bricks at the courthouse windows, right by where the voters were standing on the stairs. At this point, the crowds turned on the sailors, and in the end, 50 sailors were arrested. The 1742 violence in colonial Philadelphia shows that the political elite in Pennsylvania felt that they needed to enlist the support of the lower classes in what was otherwise just elite infighting. They made use of the diverse and opposing elements of Philadelphia society to stoke partisan violence. They pitted the Germans against the English, the merchants against the working class, the Quakers against the Presbyterians. But this was a dangerous tactic that might make a lower-class man think they should have more say in politics than just his physical muscle on Election Day. More about that in the next episode. Thank you for listening to the Found in Philadelphia podcast. If you enjoyed this mini-series about the history of Election Day in Philly, please get out there and vote. If you're curious about what voting in the streets looked like in the colonial period, please check out the podcast website at foundinphiladelphia.com. There you can find a companion blog to this episode where you can learn more, see some pictures, and find a list of my sources. And huge thanks to Professor Mark Bruin for his time and patience in creating these episodes. This episode was researched, written, hosted, and recorded by me, Lori Ament. Huge thanks to the team at The Wave Podcasting who mixed this episode and provided sound engineering.